This is also where I first met Robert Murat, who introduced himself to me on Saturday morning. I'd been asking for a translator, a local person who could help out with translating, talking to the Portuguese police, liaising, trying to get some information. And over a period of a few days, we had probably, I would say, a dozen or so conversations. He seemed like a very helpful guy. He was a helpful guy. He was also helping other members of the media. And because he was spending so much time in the area, some journalists became perhaps a little bit suspicious of why he was spending so much time here when he wasn't here in an official capacity. But we talked to him quite a lot, and when it became clear that some journalists were getting a little suspicious, I asked him what he did for a living and where he lived. He said he ran an internet business.
Chaos erupted inside apartment 5A. Kate McCann's anguished cries shattered the night's calm. They've taken her. It was the beginning of a mystery that has gripped the world for nearly 2 decades. But tonight, a chilling detail often overlooked will emerge. It wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was a silent witness. A specially trained search dog told a story that no press release could ever erase. From the start, the official story pointed to an elaborate kidnapping. But the forensic records simply didn't support it. There was no sign of a break-in, no intruder's fingerprints, no indication of a struggle. What investigators found was far more disturbing. The scent associated with human remains was detected by these highly trained dogs, both in the apartment itself and in the car the McCanns rented weeks after Madeleine disappeared. The implication was clear. Madeleine may not have left that apartment alive. The individuals last seen with the little girl were the ones who worked tirelessly to convince the world of a kidnapping. And behind their campaign lies a multi-million-dollar public relations machine, fueled by political pressure and media complicity. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. Consider the setting of Praia da Luz, a resort town where the McCann family vacationed with 7 friends, all of whom were doctors and medical professionals. On the surface, it looked like a perfect holiday, but contradictions emerged almost immediately. Despite being highly trained in crisis response, these adults gave timelines that were rife with inconsistencies. Statements changed, and details seemed to become more blurred over time rather than clearer. As confusion reigned, the stakes could not have been higher. A child was missing. International outrage was growing, and the eyes of the world were on this single family. But as public sympathy grew, so did the burden of unanswered questions. Why did the specialized sniffer dogs give such specific alerts in the McCann's apartment and hire car? Why did witness testimonies often contradict official reports? And why did political influence from the highest levels of government appear to be steering the investigation away from uncomfortable conclusions? As hours turned into days, the story became a legend. An unknown predator quietly sneaks into a holiday apartment. Yet, each review of the evidence pushes this story further away from a kidnapping and closer to a concealment. The dogs, incorruptible, unemotional, and trained to detect only what cannot be hidden, offered the clearest testimony of all. Their alerts suggested not only a tragic event, but a deliberate effort to obscure it. Midway through the investigation, re-engaging public interest became essential. Press conferences were carefully staged, and the family's allies ensured the narrative of a kidnapping dominated the headlines. Any alternative theory was dismissed as cruel speculation. But beneath the surface, GPS data, forensic tests, and behavioral analysis told a different tale. One of missteps, pressure, and a desperate attempt to maintain control of a crumbling facade. Storytelling, in this case, was not confined to investigators or journalists. It was actively constructed by those closest to Madeleine. From media tours to emotional appeals, the narrative became less about a search for truth and more about preserving reputations. Inconsistencies in witness accounts were brushed aside, while scientific evidence, far less malleable, was quietly marginalized. And so we reach the ending, where the stakes loom larger than ever. Madeleine's fate remains unresolved, but the deeper tragedy lies in the suppression of truth. 17 years later, what should have been a straightforward search for justice has been buried beneath layers of spin, diplomacy, and fear. The last photograph of her by the poolside remains frozen in time, a reminder of innocence overshadowed by deception. The unspoken question lingers. How could an educated, respected group orchestrate a deception that reshaped global perception? And why has one of the most scrutinized cases in modern history left us with more illusions than answers? The silence of a child is eternal, but the dogs spoke, and in their testimony lies the story too many have chosen to ignore. She was 3 years old, smiling by the pool under the soft Portuguese sun. That photograph became her last. Hours later, the night was torn apart by frantic cries, a single phrase echoing through the resort. "They've taken her." But beneath that chaos, the walls of apartment 5A whispered a quieter, more unsettling story. One not of an intruder, but of contradictions, impossibilities, and a silence that spoke louder than any scream. The official narrative was simple: a child stolen through the window by a faceless predator. Yet, when forensic experts examined the scene, their conclusions undermined the very foundation of that tale. The bedroom window, cited as the entry point, showed no trace of forced entry. The shutters could be raised and lowered from within, but bore no fingerprints from an outsider. To seasoned investigators, what they found looked less like a break-in and more like a stage set, an act designed to suggest intrusion where none had occurred. Compounding this problem was the second supposed access point, the sliding patio door. It had been left unlocked that night. If a kidnapper truly sought an easy way in, this door offered exactly that. Why then would anyone risk the noise and struggle of forcing open a window? The contradiction cuts to the heart of the narrative. A perpetrator cannot both slip silently through an open door and noisily pry apart a shutter. One scenario cancels the other. What remains is a story too neat, too carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny. Even more haunting was what lay inside. Madeleine's siblings, 2-year-old twins, slept just feet away from her bed. How could a stranger creep into that small room, identify Madeleine in the dim light, lift her from the bed, and leave without stirring the other children? Experts in child behavior know the difficulty of moving a toddler without noise. The absence of sound, the unbroken stillness of the twins, points not to a stealthy abduction, but to the absence of any intruder at all. Silence, in this case, became the loudest evidence. A forensic team searching the apartment days later found no fibers from an unknown person, no muddy footprints, no foreign DNA. The scene was eerily clean, unnaturally so, for what was supposed to be a chaotic crime scene. Even the dusting of the shutters produced nothing usable, except smudges attributed to the family and police themselves. Crime scenes are rarely perfect. They are messy, flawed records of sudden violence. But apartment 5A was too perfect, too untouched, leaving investigators to question whether the crime had unfolded there at all. As the case widened, the narrative of abduction solidified through repetition rather than evidence. Witnesses reported seeing men carrying children near the resort, Yet their descriptions diverged, their accounts shifted, and their timelines overlapped with moments when key individuals from the group of friends were themselves absent or moving around. Instead of clarity, the testimonies deepened the contradictions. The stakes rose with every hour. A missing child, an international audience, and the image of distraught parents fueled relentless coverage. But beneath that, the question persisted. How could an intruder vanish without leaving behind the smallest trace? Dogs trained to detect the scent of human remains later alerted inside the apartment and to the McCann's rental car. Findings that, while hotly contested, offered the first tangible signs of something darker within the walls of 5A. Storytelling became central, not just by investigators, but by those at the heart of the tragedy. Media briefings emphasized abduction. Statements repeated the same imagery. A window forced, a child stolen, danger lurking outside. Yet this story leaned more on public perception than on material proof. At the same time, forensic reports stacked up with uncomfortable details, blood traces, hair samples, and contamination at the scene. Each pointed to uncertainties that the polished narrative could not erase. By the midpoint of the investigation, the clean crime scene itself had become evidence. Investigators noted how many people had entered and touched the room before it was secured. Fingerprints belonged to police, to the parents, to neighbors, but not to a kidnapper. The very absence of unknown evidence became a form of presence. It told a story not of intrusion, but of control. As time stretched on, the silence of the twins, the contradictions in the access points, and the immaculate state of the apartment only sharpened the suspicions. Could a crime of such precision be the work of a faceless prowler, or was the perfection of the scene evidence of staging? In the end, the apartment itself became the strongest witness, its doors unforced, its windows unstained, its silence unbroken. The very place that should have revealed the violence of abduction, instead offered a sterile stillness. That void screamed louder than any broken shutter. 17 years later, the mystery of Madeleine McCann still haunts the world. When one returns to apartment 5A, stripped of the media noise, the contradictions remain. A window that tells two different stories, a door that makes an intruder unnecessary, twins that never stirred, and a scene too clean to be real. It is here, in this absence of logic, that the truth most forcefully demands to be heard. On the night Madeleine vanished, 9 adults gathered at the Ocean Club's tapas bar, barely 120 meters from the apartment where their children slept. They became known as the Tapas 7, the friends whose testimonies would form the backbone of the abduction narrative. Yet, beneath the surface, their accounts revealed contradictions that turned what should have been clarity into what felt like a carefully orchestrated script. The group claimed to have a system. One adult would leave the table every 30 minutes to check on the children. And it sounded responsible, even diligent. But when investigators examined the timeline, it collapsed under its own weight. Gerry McCann said he checked the children at around 9:05 p.m., noting Madeleine was still in bed. Just 10 minutes later, Jane Tanner described passing Gerry in the street before seeing a man carrying a child in pink pajamas. Her account, vivid in its detail, clashed with Gerry's own movements, as another witness nearby never saw her walk past. At 9:30 p.m., Matthew Oldfield entered the apartment, but rather than looking at the children, he simply listened for noise and left. In that gap lies one of the most critical uncertainties. No one could confirm whether Madeleine was still there. By 10 o'clock p.m., Kate McCann raised the alarm. This timeline, far from reinforcing an abduction theory, narrowed the supposed window of opportunity to an implausibly tight span of just 30 to 45 minutes. Instead of clarity, the overlapping accounts created confusion, almost as if the contradictions themselves were part of a shield. The neatness of the system, rotating checks, consistent intervals, looked less like natural parenting routines and more like choreography designed to give the impression of vigilance. Investigators suspected that the timeline was built not to reveal the truth, but to reinforce a story. Central to that story was Jane Tanner's sighting. Her description of a man with long, dark hair, heavily dressed for the warm evening, and carrying a barefoot child in pinkish pajamas dominated headlines for years. Artists' impressions of the so-called Tanner man circulated across Europe, fueling the image of a mysterious abductor. But years later, Operation Grange identified the figure as an innocent British holidaymaker carrying his daughter home from the creche. 6 years of global suspicion evaporated with that revelation. Yet there was another sighting, more troubling and far harder to dismiss. Around 10 o'clock p.m., just as Kate discovered Madeleine was missing, the Smith family from Ireland encountered a man carrying a sleeping girl through the streets. Unlike Tanner's shifting descriptions, the Smiths were consistent. They recalled the child's bare feet, her limp posture, and the man's build. Later, some family members stated that the man's appearance reminded them of Gerry McCann himself. The implications of that testimony, never fully explored by police, cast a shadow that still lingers. While these competing accounts might have bolstered the idea of an abduction, in practice, they unraveled it. 2 sightings of 2 different men in different places at overlapping times, each carrying a child resembling Madeleine, should have provided strength. Instead, they bred doubt. Were there truly 2 abductors operating within minutes of each other, or was one sighting an invention, a distraction to draw eyes away from another truth? The Portuguese investigators sought to resolve these contradictions with a full reenactment. They requested the Tapas 7 return to Portugal to walk through their accounts and align their stories with the geography of the resort. But the group resisted, asking questions, demanding assurances, and ultimately declining to participate. To the Polizia Giudiziaria, this refusal was telling. If the truth was on their side, why avoid recreating it? Why shield a narrative so fragile it could not withstand repetition? As the years passed, the Tapas 7 maintained a public silence, bound by legal constraints and perhaps by loyalty. When they did speak, it was often to defend their friends, to insist the McCanns could not have harmed their daughter. But their timeline, the backbone of the abduction theory, remained riddled with holes. Behind the noise of speculation and years of shifting suspects, 2 silent witnesses emerged, witnesses who could not be bribed, persuaded, or mistaken. They were not human, but dogs. Eddie and Keela were their names, elite English Springer Spaniels flown in by British authorities at the request of the Portuguese police. Eddie was a victim recovery dog, trained to detect the scent of human remains, even when a body had long been removed. Keela specialized in locating even the faintest traces of human blood, no matter how old or how thoroughly it had been cleaned. Their accuracy rates, honed through years of service, were estimated at over 90%. When they arrived in Praia da Luz in the summer of 2007, the hope was simple. If Madeleine had been taken from the apartment, the dogs would find nothing. Instead, what they uncovered told an entirely different story. Inside apartment 5A, Eddie was released first. Almost immediately he stiffened, his nose pressed to the floor behind the sofa in the living room. Then came the sound his handler had trained him to give only when certain. A sharp bark, his trained signal for the scent of human remains. Minutes later, in the parents' bedroom, he repeated the alert inside the wardrobe. To Eddie, the apartment indicated the strong presence of human remains. Then, Keela was guided to the same areas. Quietly, without hesitation, she froze. Her signal that the scent of human blood was present. The scent of blood in the exact places where Eddie had barked. The discoveries did not end there. On a pink soft toy belonging to Madeleine, Eddie alerted again. On clothing worn by Kate McCann, he gave the same unmistakable signal. The story these dogs were telling was consistent and terrifying. A tragic event had touched apartment 5A. The most damning alerts, however, were still to come. 25 days after Madeleine's disappearance, the McCanns rented a car, a grey Renault Scenic. In August, Eddie, the specialist search dog, was brought into a parking garage where 10 vehicles sat in silence. He ignored the first 3. Then, as he reached the Scenic, he erupted, alerting insistently at the boot. Minutes later, Keela confirmed it. The presence of blood traces, faint but real, inside the luggage compartment, and even on the key fob of the car itself. To seasoned investigators, it was a turning point. The dogs had told a story that was too coherent to ignore. A child had met a tragic end. Their scent lingered in the apartment, and their remains had at some point been transported in that car. Portuguese police, already under fire for their early handling of the investigation, shifted their focus. No longer was the spectre of a prowling abductor their only theory. Now, suspicion crept inward toward those closest to Madeleine. Kate and Gerry McCann were declared arguidos, formal suspects, in September 2007. Yet the silence that followed was louder than the dogs' barks. Samples from the apartment and the Scenic were rushed to the UK's Forensic Science Service. The results were devastatingly ambiguous. One report noted that a complex DNA mixture from the boot of the car contained at least 15 of Madeleine's 19 genetic markers. But the conclusion read, too complex for meaningful interpretation. It was not proof, they said, merely suggestion. And with that, the certainty of the dogs was drowned beneath the cautious language of science. For many, this raised the stakes to unbearable levels. Could the presence of so many of Madeleine's genetic markers be a coincidence? The McCann family argued it was. After all, they said, fibers and hairs from any family member could have contaminated the car. But to others, the odds seemed impossible to ignore. Why would 2 specialist dogs, one for human remains and one for blood, operating independently, both alert so strongly in the very same spots? Why would the DNA mixture lean so heavily toward Madeleine? The footage of Eddie and Keela's work was released to the public. It was unsettling to watch. The dogs' relentless noses pressed against walls, furniture, and fabric. Eddie barking behind the sofa and circling the boot of the Scenic. Keela freezing silently in front of the curtains, immovable until called away. To investigators hardened by years of difficult cases, these moments were clear. The dogs were not prone to theatrics. They did not alert out of boredom or by mistake. When they spoke with evidence. And yet, the case faltered. Lawyers argued that dog alerts alone could never constitute proof in court. They required corroboration. Without a body, without unambiguous DNA, the findings became powerful suggestions, but not conclusive proof. Kate and Gerry's suspect status was lifted less than a year later, and the official line once again shifted back to abduction. But the dog's testimony lingered, impossible to erase. The story these silent witnesses told is one of finality. They spoke of a tragedy in the apartment, of concealment, and of movement from one place to another. in the sterile silence of 5A, where shutters bore no sign of intrusion and dust offered no footprints. They revealed what human eyes could not see. For many observers, this remains the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. More compelling than shifting witness accounts, more tangible than theories of strangers in the night. The dogs had no motive to lie, no reason to protect reputations. Their alerts painted a narrative of a tragic event and concealment, a narrative that sits in direct opposition to the carefully polished story of abduction. And so, 17 years later, we return to those moments in a garage beneath the streets of Portimao. Eddie's bark reverberates, sharp and undeniable. Keela freezes, unyielding. Together, they pointed to a truth too many were unwilling to confront. When the first alarm was raised on May 3, 2007, neighbors and fellow holidaymakers recalled a scene filled with confusion and chaos. Yet what they remembered most was not Kate's cries or the frantic searches, but Gerry McCann's demeanor. Several witnesses later described him as calm to the point of being odd, focused less on scouring the resort and more on making phone calls, coordinating, and managing information. It was as if, even in those early hours, he understood that what would matter most was not only what had happened, but how it would be told. That instinct became even clearer days later when lawyers and public relations professionals began to surround the family. The McCanns did not simply grieve, they launched a campaign. Within weeks, the phrase, "Find Madeleine," was everywhere, on glossy posters, in international press conferences, and on the lips of politicians. Donations poured in, and a multi-million-pound fund was established. What might have been the desperate effort of two parents was instead run like a brand, polished and managed with an efficiency rarely seen in missing child cases. But behind the public image, in the sterile rooms of police stations, a different picture was taking shape. 3 months after Madeleine's disappearance, Kate McCann was questioned by Portuguese detectives. Over 11 hours, she was asked 48 direct questions about the night her daughter vanished. Questions about her movements, her words, the curtains moved behind the sofa, and the alerts from the specialist dogs inside the apartment. To nearly every one of these, she remained silent. She refused to answer why she said abduction immediately, why she did not shout for help from the balcony, or why she left her twins alone while raising the alarm at the tapas bar. She refused to explain the scent of human remains detected on her clothing and Madeleine's soft toy, or the traces of blood and DNA later found in the car. She would not say why her behavior during the search seemed at times motionless, even detached. To each question, the response was the same. No answer. Only one question drew a reply. When asked if she realized that her silence was hindering the investigation, Kate said, "Yes, if that's what the investigation thinks." To investigators, that silence spoke volumes. For critics, it was evidence of guilt. For supporters, it was the reaction of a mother unfairly treated as a suspect. But to the case itself, it was another void, another silence where the truth should have been. And the silences did not end there. The group of friends known as the Tapas 7, dining with the McCanns that night, presented a united front. Their timeline of child checks was riddled with contradictions, yet when Portuguese police requested a full reconstruction, they refused to return. One investigator called their refusal a wall of silence, not the behavior of witnesses desperate to solve a crime, but of allies protecting a fragile narrative. The stakes rose further as the PR campaign gathered force. Within weeks, the McCanns went from arguidos to global symbols of victimhood, Media outlets that questioned them were threatened with lawsuits, and international figures from the Pope to the Prime Minister expressed sympathy. The Portuguese police, already criticized for early missteps, found themselves under immense pressure. The investigation bent beneath the weight of politics, reputation, and influence. The result was not clarity but a fracture. On one side, the official line of abduction, broadcast through press releases and media appearances. On the other, there were the suppressed files of unanswered questions, alerts from specialist search dogs, and behavioral contradictions. Between them lay a void that has never been filled. Storytelling became central to survival. Gerry and Kate shaped a narrative of relentless hope, of tireless searching, of innocence wronged by suspicion. But the official files tell a parallel story, one of evasion, silence, and the careful management of their image. Witnesses described them as calm, when panic would have been natural. Detectives recorded their refusal to engage with fundamental questions. Lawyers and PR specialists built a wall between the family and the investigators. The behavior of the Tapas 7 only reinforces this. Their solidarity was absolute, their statements closely aligned, and their refusal to reenact the night was unshakable. To critics, it looked less like a coincidence and more like coordination, a group of intelligent professionals bound by loyalty or fear who presented a single story and never allowed it to be tested. And so, the case became less about evidence and more about control. Every unanswered question, every contradiction, and every refusal created space for speculation. Into that space poured theories, doubts, and suspicions. The silence of those who might have clarified events instead became a roar of uncertainty. 17 years later, the legacy of that behavior is clear. The 48 unanswered questions still hang over the case. The refusal to reconstruct the evening still undermines the timeline. The early decision to manage the narrative through lawyers and PR has forever blurred the line between truth and image. Perhaps the most haunting part of this story is not only what happened to Madeleine, but how those closest to her responded. Their actions, their silences, their decisions to control and to protect have shaped this case as much as any forensic sample or witness statement. The behavior of the innocent often speaks in chaos, raw, unfiltered, and desperate. But the behavior around apartment 5A was calm, controlled, and choreographed. It was the behavior of people aware that every word mattered, every gesture would be recorded, and every silence would be judged. And in those silences, the truth of what happened to Madeleine McCann remains buried. For 17 years, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann has demanded answers. Across that time, theories have risen and collapsed. But in 2020, a new name surfaced, a man whose criminal past and presence in Portugal seemed to fit the story almost too neatly. His name is Christian Bruckner, and to many, he appeared to be the monster, long missing from the narrative. Bruckner's history is as dark as it is extensive. Born in Germany in 1976, he grew into a life defined by crime, burglaries, drug dealing, theft, and a history of serious sexual offenses. By his 20s, he had already been convicted for an offense against a 6-year-old child. Later, in 2005, he committed a serious sexual assault against a 72-year-old woman in her own home in Praia da Luz, the very town where Madeleine vanished just 2 years later. It was enough to create the image of a predator hiding in plain sight. When German prosecutors named him a suspect in 2020, the world seized on the story. His yellow and white camper van had been seen near the resort. His phone had pinged off a tower close to the Ocean Club on the night Madeleine disappeared. His past painted him as dangerous, capable, even inevitable. To many, he was the answer. But beneath the headlines, the case against him dissolves. No forensic evidence links Bruckner to apartment 5A. Not a single hair, fingerprint, or trace of Madeleine has ever been tied to him. The phone data shows only that he was somewhere in the wider area, not at the scene itself. The so-called witnesses who placed him near the resort were inconsistent and, in some cases, dismissed as unreliable. Even after exhaustive searches of his properties, vehicles, and a reservoir near Lagos, nothing emerged. Bruckner himself has mocked the investigation. In a letter to police, he listed the questions he knew they could never answer. Was he seen at the scene? Was his vehicle caught near the apartment? Was there DNA evidence linking him to Madeleine? Was there a body? His answer to each was the same: no. Yet prosecutors pressed forward, not with charges, but with statements of confidence. They insisted they had concrete evidence that Madeleine had passed away, though they admitted they could not reveal it. Year after year, they promised breakthroughs that never came, and all the while, Bruckner remained in prison for his other crimes. The story of Christian Bruckner, then, is less about proof than performance. He became the face of the abduction at a time when the original narrative was faltering. The alerts from the specialist dogs, the unanswered questions from Kate McCann, the contradictions in the Tapas 7's timeline, all of these threads risked unraveling the abduction theory. By naming Bruckner, investigators could redirect the spotlight, reshaping the story into one of a dangerous predator rather than uncomfortable suspicion closer to home. For the public, it was easy to believe. But evidence is not built on convenience, and no physical link ties Christian Bruckner to Madeleine's disappearance. The risk is that Bruckner is less the culprit and more the scapegoat, a figure who allows the case to be framed as a classic abduction, neatly closing the circle while deflecting attention from the forensic evidence inside apartment 5A that tells a different story. 17 years later, the image of Christian Bruckner endures not because of proof, but because of need. The case required a villain, and he fit the role, but the case against him remains hollow. The tragedy is that by focusing so intently on Bruckner, the investigation risks drifting further from the answers that matter. It begins with a haunting image, a child full of life, suddenly gone, leaving behind an apartment that feels less like a crime scene and more like a stage. To understand this tragedy, we must move beyond the myths of abduction and step into a theory that has long been whispered but rarely given a voice. A theory of an accident, panic, and a desperate cover-up that spiraled into one of the most elaborate stories of modern times. In this reconstruction, the first act is not a shadowy intruder slipping through the night, but a simple accident inside apartment 5A. Madeleine may have woken, been disoriented, stumbled in the dark, or perhaps suffered an adverse reaction to medication given to help her sleep while her parents dined nearby. Whether it was a fall or a tragic medical miscalculation, the outcome was the same. A young life ended in silence. This was the moment when panic set in, not from a stranger lurking outside, but from within the very group sworn to protect her. The second act unfolds with unbearable tension. Imagine being a respected doctor, a professional whose life's work is to preserve life, now faced with the death of your own child under your watch. To call for help would invite accusations of negligence, possibly charges of manslaughter, and the destruction of everything: career, reputation, and family. In that crucible of fear, a decision was made. A decision not to tell the truth, but to bury it. From that instant, the path forward was set not by justice, but by survival. The third act reveals itself in the careful staging of a kidnapping, a window said to be forced, though investigators found it could only be opened from the inside. Shutters claimed to have been jimmied, yet no fingerprints, no DNA, no trace of a stranger remained. the patio door left unlocked, though that alone would have sufficed for entry. These contradictions are not the signs of a criminal mastermind. They are the fingerprints of a rushed deception. Behind the sofa, beneath the bedroom wardrobe, the specialist search dog Eddie marked the lingering scent of human remains. His partner, Keela, confirmed the presence of human blood on the very tiles later removed by forensic teams. In those minutes of panic, Madeleine's body may have been hidden, temporarily placed in the shadows of her own home. The silence of the twins that night raises further doubts. 2 toddlers slept undisturbed just feet away from where Madeleine was supposedly snatched. Could a stranger really have carried one child from that room without waking the others, without a sound, without a trace? It is far more plausible that nothing was disturbed because nothing entered. The only movements that night came not from a kidnapper, but from the people inside the apartment. The 4th act comes weeks later, when the searchlights of the press moved elsewhere and the family gained access to a new resource, a rented Renault Scenic. Almost a month had passed, but Eddie's bark rang out in the underground garage, signaling the scent of human remains in the boot of that car. Keela confirmed the presence of blood traces in the same confined space. Forensic analysis would later reveal a DNA profile, with 15 of 19 markers consistent with Madeleine in those samples. Too many to be dismissed as coincidence. Too many to be explained by casual contamination. This was not the trace of an intruder, but the residue of a body being transported. A grim journey, hidden beneath suitcases and toys, ending in a resting place that remains unknown. The 5th act is played not in Praia da Luz, but on the world stage. Lawyers, spin doctors, and a multi-million-dollar PR campaign transformed the McCanns from suspects into symbols of grief. Press conferences, interviews, and photo opportunities shifted the narrative, ensuring the eyes of the world saw grieving parents rather than potential culprits. Political pressure mounted on Portuguese investigators, their findings dismissed, their reputations smeared. What should have been an inquiry into an unlawful death became instead a tale of abduction, endlessly repeated until it hardened into accepted truth. But the cracks in that story remain. The refusal of Kate McCann to answer 48 direct questions from investigators. The contradictions in the friends' accounts of checking the children, leaving a narrow and improbable window for a kidnapper. The refusal of the group to participate in a reenactment that could have clarified the timeline. And the silent testimony of the dogs, whose senses are beyond human manipulation, pointing again and again to the same locations. The stakes of this theory are devastating. It suggests not only that Madeleine met a tragic end in apartment 5A, but that those closest to her orchestrated a deception on a global scale. It means the nightly appeals, the tearful interviews, and the worldwide campaign may have been less about finding a missing child and more about maintaining a story that kept the truth buried. It forces us to confront the possibility that a group of educated, respected professionals, doctors trained to save lives, chose to protect their own futures at the cost of their daughter's memory. The story of Madeleine McCann should have been uncovered in those first critical hours. But instead of clarity, the world witnessed one of the most profound failures of modern policing, amplified by unprecedented media and political storms. The Portuguese police were the first to arrive at apartment 5A. Their initial search was clumsy, delayed, and compromised. Borders were not sealed, roadblocks were not set up until the following day, and countless people trampled through the scene before it was secured. Yet among the chaos stood one man who dared to follow the trail others feared, Gonçalo Amaral. As lead investigator, he examined the contradictions, the alerts from the specialist dogs, and the absence of evidence for a forced entry. He put forward a simple but devastating hypothesis that Madeleine had passed away in the apartment and that the abduction story was staged. For that, he was removed, his reputation shredded, and his career dismantled under political pressure. The British government's involvement was equally extraordinary. Within days, diplomats and police officers were dispatched to Portugal, offering support but often directing the narrative. The British media turned the McCanns into sympathetic figures while painting the Portuguese police as inept. The machinery of influence was in motion, and Amaral became a villain in the press, his theory discredited not by evidence but by strategy. As years passed, Operation Grange in the UK reframed the investigation, leaning heavily on the abduction theory. New suspects were paraded before the media, but none were connected by hard forensic evidence. Each diversion served to reinforce the same fragile story, while burying the uncomfortable findings of the Portuguese forensics and the police dogs. The system had failed, not by a lack of leads, but by choosing which leads to follow and which to bury. Now, imagine the story shifting in the present day, from 2024 into 2025. Technology has advanced, and with it, the power of DNA science. Samples once deemed inconclusive from the boot of the Renault Scenic are subjected to new testing. This time, the results are sharper, cleaner, undeniable. They show a match to Madeleine's profile, not as a trace of casual transfer, but as the residue of a body once carried there. Suddenly, the whispers of the specialist dogs become scientific confirmation, impossible to ignore. At the same time, a conscience cracks open the wall of silence. One of the Tapas 7, tormented by years of secrecy, steps forward. In a private testimony that soon leaks, they admit what investigators suspected, that the timeline was rehearsed, that stories were aligned, and that doubts about Madeleine's fate had circulated among them even on that first night. And then, in a final twist, hidden archives emerge, leaked documents showing that British officials were warned early on about the reliability of the specialist dogs, yet chose to sideline those leads, fearing the political fallout. If these developments were to hold, they would confirm a betrayal not only of a little girl, but of justice itself. The failure was not just procedural, but systemic, shaped by diplomacy, media manipulation, and the protection of reputations at the expense of truth. For 17 years, the story has been told as one of abduction. But with new DNA and confessions laid bare, that narrative begins to collapse. The tragedy is that Madeleine's fate may have been known all along, hidden behind walls of influence. What began as a child's disappearance became an international theater where truth was scripted, edited, and performed. The story of Madeleine McCann is no longer just the story of a missing child. It has become a symbol of how money, influence, and a relentless public relations machine can shape perception, silence doubt, and bend justice itself. Yet beneath that noise, the science has never wavered. The alerts from the dogs, the DNA markers, the unanswered questions, they remain cold and unyielding, a silent testimony that refuses to disappear. Justice for Madeleine cannot be found in chasing the phantom of an abductor who may never have existed. It lies in confronting the evidence, however painful, and facing the choices made inside apartment 5A. The question is not whether the truth is there. It always has been. The question is whether we are ready at last to face it. After journeying through this labyrinth of phantoms, shifting timelines and official narratives, how does this alternative perspective make you feel? Does it challenge everything you thought you knew about this tragic case? When the line between truth and illusion becomes so blurred, and when institutions we trust may be shaping the story, where do you believe the path to justice for Madeleine truly lies? Share your thoughts below. Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.